The library at Thornfield Manor smelled of leather and beeswax, and something deeper, the particular mustiness of old paper that spoke of centuries of accumulated wisdom. It had become Lydia Carwell's sanctuary every evening since her family's arrival 5 days ago, a place where the silence felt like permission rather than judgment. She should have been in the drawing room, smiling through the performance of courtship while Lord Felix Ashton regaled the assembled company with yet another tedious hunting story. She should have been sitting beside her mother, nodding at appropriate intervals, demonstrating the feminine accomplishments expected of a woman desperate enough to accept a proposal from a man drowning in debts. Instead, she sat curled in the window seat farthest from the door, her legs tucked beneath her skirts, her diary open across her knees like a confession. A single candle flickered on the small table beside her, casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with books she would never have time to read. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of laughter from the drawing room, artificial performative laughter that made her stomach clench with something between resentment and exhaustion. "Insufferable," she muttered, her pen scratching furiously across the page with a violence that surprised even her. The nib caught on the paper, leaving an angry blot. But she did not care. Then, because the silence demanded honesty, she could never speak aloud, because the darkness felt safe enough to hold her truths. She began to read her own words, back in a whisper that grew bolder with each line. Lord Felix Ashton smiles, as though he has conquered empires, but he has only conquered card tables and the patience of every woman unfortunate enough to sit beside him at dinner. He speaks of his horses with more genuine affection than he has shown any human being in my presence. This morning at breakfast, he spent 20 minutes describing the bloodline of his new hunter, while my mother nodded as though he were reciting poetry. This afternoon he asked about my little sketches, as though my botanical illustrations were the doodlings of a child with nothing better to occupy her time. Her voice grew stronger, emboldened by solitude and the fierce pleasure of speaking unvarnished truth. I told him they were scientific studies, that I had been working with specimens from the estate greenhouse and corresponding with botanists in London about classification systems. He laughed. He actually laughed, not with me, but at me, as if expertise in anything beyond needlework and French were an amusing affectation in a woman, as if knowledge itself were something I put on like jewelry, meant only for display rather than substance. She paused, pressing the pen harder against the paper until the nib bent and nearly tore through to the page beneath. Her hand trembled slightly, and she took a breath before continuing. "Mama looks at me as though I am a bolt of fabric she cannot sell. Good quality, perhaps, but in an unfashionable color that no one wants. Perhaps she is right. Perhaps I am unsellable, too plain, too peculiar, too fond of books that do not improve my complexion or enhance my conversation in ways men find charming. Felix courts me because his creditors require payment, and my modest inheritance, the small estate Papa left, represents a solution to his financial embarrassment. I'm not a person to him. I'm not even really a woman. I'm a transaction wrapped in muslin and presented at dinner, and I'm supposed to smile and accept this as the best I deserve, as the natural order of things." Her voice cracked on the final words, and she drew a shaking breath, pressing her free hand against her chest as if she could physically hold herself together. The truth written in darkness felt both liberating and shameful, a relief to speak and a humiliation to acknowledge. Here, alone with only shadows as witnesses, she could admit what daylight would never permit, that she was tired. So desperately, bone-deep tired of pretending that charm and submission came naturally, that she did not resent her mother's constant disappointment, that she could smile through another dinner where men spoke over her and women judged her, that she feared, with a terror that kept her awake at night, that she would spend her entire life as an afterthought in someone else's story, never the heroine of her own. "How very honest of you." The voice came from the shadows near the bookshelf to her left, low, cultured, and devastatingly unexpected. It rolled through the quiet library like distant thunder, shattering her illusion of solitude with brutal efficiency. Lydia's diary slipped from her hands, hitting the hardwood floor with a sound like a gunshot in the hushed room. She spun toward the darkness, her heart hammering so violently she thought she might actually be sick. Her breath caught in her throat, strangling any sound that might have escaped. A figure emerged slowly, deliberately, from behind the tall mahogany shelf that had concealed him, and the candlelight caught the severe, aristocratic lines of a face she recognized with mounting, absolute horror. Nathaniel Graydon, Duke of Ravensmere, the most powerful man in 3 counties, possibly in all of England. The man her mother had warned her never to bore with conversation, never to presume upon, never to forget, was so far above their station that even acknowledging his existence was an act of presumption. The man who was, even now, expected to propose to Lady Constance Marlowe before the fortnight ended, a match everyone agreed was perfect in pedigree, fortune, and suitability. He had heard everything, every word, every humiliating, unguarded confession. "Your Grace," she managed, scrambling to her feet so quickly she nearly knocked over the candle. Hot wax splattered across the table, narrowly missing her hand. I thought I was alone. I did not. Clearly." He moved closer with measured steps, each one deliberate and unhurried, his dark eyes fixed on her burning face with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the floorboards. He was tall, perhaps too tall, with the kind of aristocratic elegance that seemed bred into the bones of men like him. Everything about him spoke of power and privilege, the perfect cut of his evening coat, the casual way he carried himself, the quiet authority in every gesture. It made her acutely, painfully aware of her wrinkled skirts, the ink stains on her fingers, the way her hair had begun escaping its pins hours ago. "I came here to escape tedious conversation." "It seems you had the same idea, Miss Carwell. How long were you—" She could not finish the question, could not bear to know the answer, but it was written in the slight curve of his mouth, something that might have been amusement or pity or something worse, condescension. "Long enough to learn that you have strong opinions about Lord Ashton's equestrian priorities." He moved to where her diary lay fallen on the floor and bent to retrieve it with an economy of movement that suggested he did everything with that same controlled grace. Lydia's breath stopped entirely. His long fingers brushed the worn leather cover. She had owned this diary for 3 years, had filled it with thoughts she would die before sharing, and for one terrible, endless moment she thought he might open it, might read the other entries, the ones about feeling invisible at dinners, about her mother's coldness, about fearing she would never be chosen for who she truly was, only for what she could provide. But he simply held it out to her, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. When she snatched it back with trembling hands, clutching it against her chest like armor, he said something she did not expect, something that made her meet his eyes despite her mortification. "You write well, Miss Carwell. Honestly. That is rarer than you might think in my world. Perhaps rarer than you realize." Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the corridor beyond, leaving her alone with her mortification, her racing heart, and the terrible certainty that her life had just become infinitely, impossibly more complicated. Lydia did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow guest bed, staring at the ceiling where moonlight painted silver patterns through the window, replaying every word she had read aloud. Had she mentioned anyone else by name? Had she written anything about the Duke himself? She racked her memory until her head ached, but she could not remember with certainty. The not knowing felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in darkness, waiting to discover if the ground beneath her feet was solid or merely air before a fatal drop. By the time pale dawn light crept through her window, she had convinced herself of 2 things. First, that she must avoid the Duke entirely for the remainder of her family's stay at Thornfield, and second, that she needed to burn her diary before anyone else could find it and use her private thoughts against her. But the second resolution died a swift death when she opened the small drawer of her writing desk after breakfast and found 3 pages missing from her diary. Clean tears along the binding, as though someone had removed them with careful, deliberate precision. Not ripped in haste, but extracted methodically by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Her hands went cold, despite the warmth of the morning. She rifled through the remaining pages with increasing panic, trying to remember what she had written on those particular sheets. Had it been the entry about her mother's coldness, the way Mama looked at her with barely concealed disappointment whenever she failed to charm a potential suitor? Or the one where she had admitted in a moment of deep despair that she sometimes imagined running away to become a governess, anything to escape the endless, exhausting performance of being marriageable? Or worse, had it been one of the more recent entries, written after that first meeting with the Duke in the library? A sharp knock at her door made her slam the diary shut with guilty violence. "Lydia, you are late for breakfast." Her mother's voice carried the sharp edge of disappointment that Lydia knew as intimately as her own heartbeat. "Lord Felix has been asking for you. Again. Do not make me come in there." Of course he had been asking. Lord Felix Ashton asked for her with the same enthusiasm he might request another glass of port, a social obligation to be fulfilled before moving on to more interesting pursuits. She had watched him at dinner the previous evening, seen the way his gaze drifted to the younger girls at the table, the ones who giggled at his stories and did not question his hunting anecdotes or correct his casual misogyny. She dressed quickly, choosing a pale blue morning gown that her mother insisted made her look almost pretty. "If you would just smile more, Lydia." She went downstairs with her diary hidden at the bottom of her trunk, beneath layers of petticoats and stockings where prying hands might not think to search, though clearly someone already had thought to search. Someone had violated her privacy, stolen her words, and she had no idea who or why or what they planned to do with those stolen confessions. The breakfast room hummed with the kind of polite conversation that always sounded slightly false to Lydia's ears, performative pleasantries exchanged like currency. Lord Felix held court at one end of the long table, regaling a captive audience with yet another story about a fox hunt, his hands gesturing dramatically as he described the final moments of the chase. Lydia slipped into an empty chair beside her younger sister, Catherine, who squeezed her hand under the table in sympathy and understanding. "Mamma is furious," Catherine whispered, barely moving her lips. "You missed morning prayers, and Lady Constance made a comment about it," I was reading. "That is precisely what Mamma is furious about. Lady Constance suggested that excessive reading makes women nervous and unsuitable for domestic responsibilities." Catherine's tone suggested what she thought of that particular opinion. Lydia felt a surge of affection for her sister. At 19, Catherine still possessed an optimism that Lydia had lost somewhere in her mid-20s, still believed that good things happened to good people if you were just patient and kind enough. Lydia desperately hoped her sister would never learn otherwise. Across the table, Lady Constance Marlowe sat with the serene confidence of a woman who had never doubted her place in the world or questioned whether she deserved the privileges she enjoyed. She was beautiful in the way that fashion plates were beautiful, perfectly proportioned, perfectly mannered, perfectly calculated. Her blonde hair caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows, arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken her maid an hour to achieve. She laughed at something Lord Felix said, the sound like wind chimes, pretty, hollow, and ultimately meaningless. Lydia saw her mother watch that laugh with naked envy. "That is what you should be," her mother's expression said as clearly as words. "That is what I raised you to become, and you have failed me utterly. But Lydia had never mastered the art of performing joy she did not feel. And she had certainly never mastered the art of pretending men, like Lord Felix, were anything other than what they were. Charming predators hunting for the easiest prey, looking for women desperate or naive enough to overlook their flaws and debts. Miss Carwell. The Duke's voice cut through the breakfast chatter like a blade through silk, sharp and impossible to ignore. Lydia's head snapped up, her heart resuming the frantic rhythm it had maintained since the library encounter. He stood in the doorway, dressed impeccably in dark green superfine that probably cost more than her family's annual income, his expression carefully unreadable. "A word, if you please, regarding the charitable project." She blinked at him, genuinely confused. Charitable project? What charitable project? Her mother beamed with an enthusiasm that was painful to witness. "Of course, Your Grace. Lydia would be honored. So very honored." She shot Lydia a look that promised severe consequences if she somehow ruined this unexpected opportunity. There was nothing to do but follow him into the hallway, acutely aware of every eye in the breakfast room tracking their departure. He waited until a passing servant had rounded the corner, until they were as alone as they could be in a house full of guests and staff, before speaking. "I am saving you from an hour of Lord Ashton's hunting stories," he said quietly, and there was something in his tone, dry amusement perhaps, that surprised her. "You are welcome." "I thank you." Lydia's mind raced, trying to understand what game he was playing. Dukes did not rescue awkward spinsters from tedious breakfast conversation. There had to be a reason, an angle she was not seeing. But there is no charitable project, is there? There is now. Something flickered in his dark eyes, amusement, calculation, or perhaps something else entirely. "My mother has decided that the young ladies present at Thornfield should compete to organize a benefit ball for the local parish. You and Lady Constance will co-chair the planning committee. I'm to serve as judge of your efforts and determine which of you demonstrates superior organizational capabilities." That sounds like a magnificent waste of everyone's time and a thinly veiled excuse to create competition between women for your mother's entertainment. The words escaped before she could stop them, and Lydia clamped her mouth shut, horrified. This was exactly the kind of unguarded honesty that her mother had warned her against 1,000 times. Men did not want truth. They wanted agreement. But the Duke only tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and, strangely, impossibly seen. "Perhaps," he agreed, and was that approval in his voice? "But it will keep you occupied and away from unwanted attention. Unless you prefer Lord Ashton's company, I would prefer a plague of locusts to Lord Ashton's company, or possibly a swarm of hornets. I am undecided on which would be less painful." This time he did smile, small, restrained, but unmistakably genuine. It transformed his face, softening the severe lines and making him look younger, more human. "Then consider this your escape, Miss Carwell. The first planning meeting is this afternoon in the green drawing room at 2 o'clock precisely. Do try to arrive on time. Lady Constance dislikes tardiness and will use it as evidence of your unsuitability for positions of responsibility." He left her standing in the hallway, her heart pounding with something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but some uncomfortable mixture of both. Whatever game he was playing, she did not understand the rules. But perhaps, just perhaps, words written in shadow could find their way to those who might actually understand them, who might see value in honesty rather than performance. The green drawing room proved to be a battlefield disguised as a parlour, all elegant furniture and deadly intent. Lady Constance arrived precisely on time, accompanied by 2 friends who served as her personal chorus of agreement. Miss Hartwell and Lady Margaret, both daughters of minor nobility with more pride than fortune. Lydia came 3 minutes late, carrying a notebook she had borrowed from the estate's library, and a stubborn determination not to be intimidated by women whose greatest accomplishment was memorizing the social hierarchy. "Miss Carwell." Lady Constance's smile could have frozen wine in its glass. "How kind of you to join us eventually. I was just explaining to His Grace that efficiency requires singular vision and unified leadership. Perhaps it would be best if I took the lead on all major decisions, given my family's extensive experience with charitable events of this nature." The Duke sat in a chair by the window, apparently absorbed in reviewing correspondence. But Lydia caught the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was listening far more carefully than he appeared. He was good at this, pretending disinterest while gathering intelligence. She filed that observation away for future reference. "Efficiency also requires diverse perspectives," Lydia replied, taking a seat across from Constance and meeting her cold blue eyes directly. She refused to be cowed, refused to play the grateful subordinate. "Unless you believe only one kind of woman should be represented at a function meant to benefit the entire parish, that seems rather contrary to the charitable spirit, does it not?" Constance's smile tightened fractionally. "I believe experience matters, Miss Carwell. My family has hosted dozens of such events. We understand the expectations of quality guests. And mine has attended dozens, which means I know what those quality guests find tedious." Lydia opened her notebook, grateful that her hands did not shake despite the adrenaline flooding her system. For instance, the obligatory auction of donated items that no one actually wants, gloves from 3 seasons ago, watercolor paintings of dubious merit, books missing half their pages, or the speeches that run so long people flee to the card rooms to escape the tedium. One of Constance's friends, Lady Margaret, gasped softly, as if Lydia had suggested burning down the church and dancing on the ashes. Miss Hartwell looked uncomfortable but said nothing, but the Duke set down his papers with deliberate care and looked at Lydia with something that might have been interest. "What would you suggest instead, Miss Carwell?" This was a test. She knew it with sudden certainty. He wanted to see if she could back up her criticism with actual ideas, or if she was simply contrary for the sake of it. "Invite the local tradespeople to showcase their crafts and take commissions," she said. The idea forming even as she spoke, crystallizing into something concrete, a furniture maker demonstrating his joinery technique, a seamstress displaying different embroidery styles and taking orders for custom work, a silversmith perhaps showing his process. Let the guests place orders on the spot, with a significant portion of each commission going directly to charity. It gives people something genuinely engaging to observe and participate in. It supports local business, and it raises funds through actual economic activity rather than guilt-motivated donations. The silence that fell over the room felt heavy, charged. Constance's expression suggested Lydia had proposed dancing naked on the dining table while reciting revolutionary poetry. "That is," Constance began, her voice sharp with outrage, "brilliant!" The Duke interrupted her without apology, leaning forward slightly, his full attention fixed on Lydia's face in a way that made her breath catch. "Practical, genuinely engaging, and actually charitable rather than performatively so. See that it is implemented, Lady Constance." It was not a suggestion or a request. It was a command, delivered with the quiet, unshakable authority of a man who had been born to power and wielded it with casual precision. Constance's jaw tightened until Lydia thought she might hear teeth crack, but she nodded with brittle grace. "Of course, Your Grace. If Miss Carwell wishes to manage the outreach to common tradespeople, I am certain she will find it educational. Some of us are more comfortable associating with merchants than others." The insult landed like a calculated slap, a reminder that Lydia's family, while gentry, was several social tiers below Constance's titled relations. But Lydia refused to flinch, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the barb had struck. "I look forward to the education, Lady Constance. One can always benefit from understanding how things of actual value are created. The meeting continued for another hour, with Constance systematically attempting to undermine every suggestion Lydia made. But the Duke remained present throughout, occasionally interjecting with questions that forced Constance to acknowledge the merit in Lydia's ideas. And once, when Lady Margaret made a snide comment about inappropriate ambition in unmarried women of uncertain prospects, the Duke had simply said, "I find ambition far more interesting than false modesty and performative helplessness." And the room had fallen into uncomfortable silence. When they finally dispersed, Lydia gathered her notebook and stood to leave, only to find the Duke blocking her path to the door. Constance and her companions had already swept out in a rustle of expensive fabric and wounded pride, their whispers echoing down the corridor like poison. "A moment, Miss Carwell." She waited until the sound of footsteps had faded entirely, until they were as alone as propriety would permit. Then she met his gaze, trying desperately to ignore the way his proximity made her pulse quicken and her skin feel too warm. "You did not need to defend me, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I can manage Lady Constance on my own. I defended good ideas, not you specifically." But his tone suggested otherwise, carried an undercurrent she could not quite identify. "Though I admit I am curious about something. Why are you here at Thornfield at all, Miss Carwell? You clearly do not wish to marry Lord Ashton. You barely tolerate his presence. Yet your family has accepted his invitation to stay, and your mother encourages the courtship at every opportunity. Why submit to something that makes you so obviously miserable? What I wish is irrelevant, Your Grace." The words came out more bitter than she intended. "My family needs the security his name and remaining fortune would provide. My father left us comfortable but not wealthy, and comfortable disappears quickly when there are debts and a crumbling estate to maintain. Felix may be insufferable, but he is an acceptable match by society's standards. That must be sufficient, even if it makes you miserable for the rest of your life." The question hung between them, intimate and dangerous. Lydia thought of her diary, of the pages someone had stolen, of all the truths she had never dared speak in daylight, but had poured onto paper in desperate solitude. "Misery is relative, Your Grace. Some of us do not have the luxury of marrying for affection or compatibility. We must be practical, must think of family obligations and social expectations. Surely you understand that better than most. And what would you marry for if you had the choice, if practical considerations did not exist?" She should have deflected with something charming and meaningless, should have smiled and changed the subject. Instead, she found herself answering with painful, dangerous honesty. "Respect, partnership, someone who sees me as more than decorative or useful or a solution to a problem. Someone who would not laugh at my botanical illustrations or suggest my interests are charming affectations that I will abandon once properly married. Someone who would value my mind as much as my dowry." She paused, then added softly, "But those are fairy tales for children, Your Grace, and I stopped believing in fairy tales years ago. Reality is considerably less romantic." Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, sympathy, or perhaps something more dangerous. He reached out as if to touch her arm, then seemed to think better of it, his hand falling back to his side. "Not all of us are Lord Ashton, Miss Carwell. No. Some of you are dukes who court beautiful women who will never challenge you or question your authority, who will manage your households with perfect efficiency and produce heirs without complaint. That seems far more practical than fairy tales about partnership and respect." She regretted the words immediately. Too honest, too sharp, too revealing. The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she had pushed too far. Then he stepped back deliberately, putting proper distance between them. "Lady Constance and I are not engaged, Miss Carwell. We are exploring compatibility, as you put it. Nothing has been decided." Then I wish you both great happiness in your exploration, Your Grace." She moved past him before he could respond, her heart hammering with the reckless thrill of having spoken truth to power and somehow survived. Behind her, she heard him say her name once, softly, "Miss Carwell," but she did not turn back. Some conversations were too dangerous to continue. Some truths once spoken could never be retrieved, and she had already revealed far more than was wise. And words written in shadow were already finding their way to someone who might understand them, even if that understanding led nowhere but heartbreak and impossible longing. The following morning brought Lydia's first taste of social consequence. At breakfast, several ladies who had previously ignored her existence now watched her with barely concealed curiosity, studying her as if she were a curiosity in a menagerie, something strange and potentially dangerous. Lord Felix arrived late, his smile tighter than usual, and made a pointed comment about women who overstep their natural sphere of influence and forget their proper place. Her mother cornered her the moment breakfast ended, gripping her arm hard enough to leave marks that would purple by evening. "What did you say to the Duke yesterday, Lydia? Tell me exactly." "Nothing improper, Mama. We discussed the charitable event, nothing more." "That is not what Lady Constance is telling everyone." Her mother's voice dropped to a furious whisper. "She says you made inappropriate suggestions, spoke above your station, and that His Grace was forced to correct your presumption publicly. She is telling everyone you embarrassed yourself and our family." Lydia's stomach dropped as understanding crystallized. This was how Constance would wage war, not through direct confrontation where witnesses could determine truth, but through whispers and strategic reframing. In every drawing-room conversation, every tea gathering, Lydia's ideas would be recast as laughable presumption. The Duke's support would be reinterpreted as polite tolerance of an awkward girl who did not know her place. "That is a complete fabrication, Mamma. The Duke approved every suggestion I made." "Then why is Lady Constance claiming otherwise? Why are people looking at us with pity?" "Because she sees me as a threat," Lydia thought with sudden, perfect clarity. "Because the Duke looked at me like I mattered, like my thoughts had value. Because in a world where women compete for male attention like starving dogs fighting over scraps, any woman who receives unexpected notice becomes an enemy to be eliminated." But she could not say any of that to her mother, who had spent her entire life navigating by those same brutal rules and could not imagine any other way to survive. "I cannot control what Lady Constance says, Mamma." "Then control yourself." Her mother's fingers dug deeper, would definitely leave bruises. "You will go to her right now. You will apologize for any offense given. You will defer to her judgment in all matters, and you will stop trying to be clever in front of the Duke. It is not attractive, Lydia. Men do not want—" "What? A partner? An equal? Someone with thoughts of her own?" The slap came so fast Lydia did not see it coming. Her mother's hand cracked across her cheek, sharp and sudden and ringing in the quiet hallway. They stared at each other in the shocked silence that followed, both breathing hard, both horrified in different ways. "You will ruin this family," her mother whispered, and there were tears in her eyes now, fury and fear mixed together. "Your father left us nothing but debts and that crumbling estate in Cornwall. Felix is our only viable option. And if you cost us this match because you cannot control your pride, because you cannot smile and nod and be grateful for attention from any man willing to marry you, then Catherine will suffer for it. Is that what you want? Your sister condemned to poverty, forced into service or a desperate marriage because you could not keep your opinions to yourself." Lydia touched her stinging cheek, tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. The weight of responsibility, heavy, suffocating, inescapable, settled over her like a burial shroud. "No, Mamma." "Then go to Lady Constance, now, and make this right before it is too late." She found Constance in the music room, playing the pianoforte with technical precision and absolutely no soul. The notes were perfect, but empty, beautiful and meaningless. Two of her friends sat nearby on a settee, embroidering something elaborate and useless, their heads bent together in whispered conversation that stopped abruptly when Lydia entered. They all looked up, and Lydia saw the triumph in Constance's eyes. Before the other woman even spoke, she had been waiting for this, anticipating it, savoring the inevitable moment when Lydia would be forced to bend. "Miss Carwell, how unexpected. I thought you would be busy consorting with tradespeople this morning." "I came to apologize," Lydia forced out, each word like gravel scraping her throat raw. "If I overstepped yesterday, or if my suggestion seemed presumptuous, it was not my intention. I would be honored to follow your direction regarding all aspects of the charitable planning." Constance's smile was all teeth and no warmth, predatory and cold. "How generous of you. Though I must say, I find your sudden deference rather suspicious, Miss Carwell. Did your mother perhaps explain the reality of your situation, the precariousness of your position?" One of her friends, Lady Margaret, giggled behind her hand. Lydia kept her face carefully blank, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the barb had struck, how much it cost her to stand here and abase herself. "I simply wish to contribute appropriately, Lady Constance. Nothing more." "Then contribute by staying out of my way." Constance struck a harsh, discordant chord on the piano, making them all flinch at the violence of it. "The Duke's attention is not yours to claim, Miss Carwell. You may have impressed him temporarily with your little schemes and unconventional ideas, but he knows quality when he sees it. He understands breeding, proper connections, suitable matches, and you, my dear, are decidedly common. A minor gentry family with more pride than fortune, thinking you can compete with your betters." The words should not have hurt. Lydia had heard variations of them her entire life. From her mother, from girls at school, from men like Felix who saw her as a last resort, when prettier, richer options rejected them. But hearing them spoken with such casual, calculated cruelty by a woman the Duke was expected to marry made something inside her crack and splinter. "You are absolutely right, Lady Constance," she said quietly, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, calm, almost detached. "I am common. I have no grand connections, no impressive dowry, no accomplishments beyond reading too much and speaking too honestly for polite society, but at least I am real. At least my thoughts are my own and not borrowed from whomever I think will advance my position. Can you say the same?" She left before Constance could respond, before the shock on the other woman's face could transform into rage. Her heart pounded with the savage satisfaction of having landed a blow, even if it cost her everything she was supposed to want. Behind her, she heard Constance's voice rise in outrage, heard the frantic whispers of her friends, but she did not stay to listen. Some battles were worth losing if they meant keeping a piece of your dignity intact. Some words needed to be spoken even when silence would be safer. What she did not see was the Duke standing in the shadowed doorway she had just passed, close enough to have heard every word of the exchange. What she did not know was that he had come looking for her specifically, drawn by concern, and something he could not name and did not entirely want to examine. And what she could not have guessed was that watching her defend herself with nothing but words and wounded pride had made him absolutely certain of something he had been trying to deny since that first night in the library. He was falling, had already fallen, for a woman he had no business wanting, and it was going to complicate absolutely everything. That afternoon, Lydia escaped to the village of Thornbrook under the pretense of meeting with local tradespeople about the benefit ball. Her mother had objected strenuously, but Catherine had volunteered to accompany her as chaperone, and the concession had been grudgingly granted with strict instructions about proper behavior. The village sat 3 miles from Thornfield Manor, a collection of weathered stone buildings clustered around a modest square with an ancient market cross at its center. Lydia breathed easier the moment their carriage arrived, grateful to be away from Constance's cold scrutiny and her mother's disappointed sighs, and the suffocating weight of expectations she could never meet. "You should not have challenged Lady Constance," Catherine said quietly as they walked toward the furniture-maker's shop, her hand tucked into Lydia's arm. "Mamma is furious beyond anything I have seen before. Mamma is always furious with me. At least this time I earned it honestly." Catherine laughed despite the gravity of the situation, the sound bright and clear in the afternoon air. At 19, she still possessed the optimism and hope that Lydia had lost somewhere in her mid-20s, still believed that good things happen to good people if you were just patient and kind enough. Lydia desperately hoped, with a fierce protectiveness that surprised her, that her sister would never learn otherwise. The furniture maker, Mr. Brennan, proved enthusiastic about showcasing his work at the benefit ball. He was a man in his 50s, with calloused hands and proud eyes, and he showed them beautiful pieces, chairs with intricate carvings that must have taken weeks, a writing desk with hidden compartments and inlaid wood in geometric patterns, a small table with legs carved to resemble twisted vines. "My son does the fine detail work now," he explained, running his hand over one of the chair backs with obvious affection. "His eyes are younger than mine, but together we create pieces that will last generations, Miss Carwell. Quality work deserves recognition. And you shall have it, Mr. Brennan. I promise you that." The seamstress, Mrs. Hewitt, nearly cried when Lydia explained the opportunity, clutching her hands with work-roughened fingers and promising embroidery samples that would make the fine ladies weep with envy and open their purses eagerly. "You are giving real people real hope, Miss Carwell," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just charity that makes the giver feel virtuous. You are offering opportunity, dignity. That is rarer than you know." By the time they finished meeting with 6 different craftspeople, a silversmith, a bookbinder, a glassblower, and others, Lydia felt something she had not experienced in weeks, genuine accomplishment untainted by social maneuvering. These were real people who would benefit from real exposure to wealthy patrons. This was worth doing, even if Constance would inevitably claim all the credit when the event proved successful. They were heading back toward their waiting carriage when Catherine suddenly gripped her arm with startling force. "Lydia, is that—" The Duke's horse stood tethered outside the village inn, impossible to mistake with its distinctive black coat and silver tack that probably cost more than most villagers earned in a year. And emerging from the inn itself was the Duke, deep in conversation with Lord Felix. Lydia's stomach clenched with instinctive dread. They were too far away to hear what was being said, but Felix's expression was unpleasant, ugly in a way she had never seen before, and the Duke's posture radiated barely controlled tension. Then Felix saw her across the square, and his face transformed into something genuinely frightening, rage and wounded pride, and something that looked almost like hatred. He strode toward them with deliberate, aggressive purpose, the Duke following a step behind with a hand raised, as if in warning. Catherine pressed closer to Lydia's side, suddenly nervous, her earlier brightness dimming. "Miss Carwell." "No," Felix's voice carried across the square, making several villagers turn to stare at the unfolding scene. "How very convenient to find you here, conducting business in public like a common merchant. I was just explaining to His Grace how inappropriate it is for unmarried ladies of gentle birth to involve themselves in trade without proper male supervision." "I have supervision," Lydia replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My sister is with me, and we are conducting legitimate charitable business, approved by the Dowager Duchess herself." "Your sister is 19 years old. Hardly adequate supervision. And you are making a spectacle of yourself, Miss Carwell, traipsing about the village like you have the right to conduct business on your own authority." His hand shot out suddenly, gripping her wrist hard enough to make her gasp in pain. We are leaving now. You will get in my carriage, and we will return to Thornfield, where I will explain to your mother exactly how you have embarrassed yourself and insulted me." The Duke moved with startling predatory speed. His hand closed over Felix's wrist in a grip that made the younger man yelp in pain and surprise, his fingers releasing Lydia immediately. "Release her." His voice was soft, deadly, the kind of dangerous quiet that preceded violence. Immediately, Felix's hand dropped, and he stumbled back a step, cradling his wrist with an expression of outrage mixed with genuine fear. "Your Grace, I was merely assaulting a lady in public view." The Duke positioned himself between Lydia and Felix, his body a solid wall of protection. "I saw what you did, Ashton, as did everyone else in this square. You will apologize to Miss Carwell with sincerity, and then you will return to Thornfield Manor, alone. And you will consider very carefully whether you wish to continue your courtship, because I promise you, if I witness such behavior again, you will answer for it in ways you will not enjoy. I am her intended suitor. You are nothing to her until she explicitly accepts your proposal, which I understand she has not done. You have no claim on her person or her behavior. Apologize, now." It was not a request, but a command backed by centuries of aristocratic authority and genuine fury. Felix's face flushed dark red with humiliation, but he managed a stiff, graceless bow in Lydia's direction. "Forgive me, Miss Carwell. I was concerned for your reputation, and expressed that concern poorly." "Your concern is noted and entirely unwanted," Lydia said coldly, finding strength in the Duke's solid presence behind her. "Good day, Lord Felix." She watched him retreat to his horse and ride away at speed, clearly furious, his pride wounded beyond repair. The villagers slowly returned to their business, though several shot curious speculative glances at their small group. And the Duke remained standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that propriety dictated she should step away immediately. She did not step away. "Are you hurt, Miss Carwell?" His voice had lost its dangerous edge, replaced by something softer, concerned. "No. Thank you for—" She had to stop and swallow hard against the sudden tightness in her throat, the wave of delayed reaction washing over her. "You did not have to intervene. I could have managed him." "No, you could not have, not without making the situation significantly worse." He glanced down at her wrist, where Felix's brutal grip had left angry red marks against her skin. Something fierce and protective moved behind his eyes. "He will not touch you again. I will make absolutely certain of it." It was a promise, and promises from dukes carried weight, had real consequences. But it was also dangerous, because Felix's pride would not tolerate this public humiliation. He would retaliate somehow, would make Lydia pay for his embarrassment. "Your Grace," she said carefully, trying to be practical despite her shaking hands, "you are making this worse for me. Felix will not forget this. Felix will do nothing, because he understands perfectly well that I can destroy him financially and socially with minimal effort." His tone was matter-of-fact, stating simple truth. "He is drowning in debts, and I control access to several creditors he desperately needs to appease. If he retaliates against you in any way, he will discover exactly how unpleasant I can make his life. Does that reassure you?" "It terrifies me, actually." He blinked, surprised. "Why?" "Because you are using your power to protect me, which means you care what happens to me, which means I matter to you somehow. And that is dangerous for both of us, Your Grace. You know it is." The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither could safely say. Catherine stood a few steps away, tactfully pretending to examine the market cross with great fascination. "Miss Carwell," he said finally, his voice low and intense, "I must ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Your diary, the pages that are missing, do you know who took them?" Her blood went cold despite the afternoon warmth. "How did you know about—" "I saw you checking it this morning at breakfast. You looked frightened, kept touching your reticule as if confirming something was still there. Then later I saw you without it, and your expression was hunted. His gaze held hers with uncomfortable intensity. If someone is using your private thoughts against you, weaponizing your own words, you need to tell me. I can help. Why? The word burst out harsh, defensive. Why would you care about my diary or my thoughts or anything about me? You are engaged, no, exploring compatibility, whatever delicate term we are using today, with Lady Constance. I am merely the awkward girl you found reading embarrassing confessions aloud in a library. This attention you are paying me cannot exist, Your Grace. It cannot lead anywhere but disaster. You are not awkward. You are honest in a world drowning in performance. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something private, meant only for her ears. The truth you wrote in your diary found its way to someone who desperately needed to hear it, Miss Carwell. Someone who has been suffocating under expectations and duty for so long, he forgot what it felt like to want something real, something authentic. You reminded me. And I cannot... He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. I cannot unknow that now. The confession hung between them, dangerous and impossible and heartbreakingly sincere. Catherine made a small, startled sound nearby, reminding them both that they had an audience, that this moment was not entirely private, no matter how much it felt that way. Your Grace, Lydia whispered, her heart breaking, you should not say such things to me. Not here, not ever. I know, but I seem constitutionally unable to stop myself where you are concerned. He stepped back then, deliberately putting proper social distance between them, and the loss of his proximity felt like a physical ache. He turned to Catherine with visible effort, his voice returning to formal courtesy that sounded forced. Miss Catherine, would you permit me to escort you both back to Thornfield? I believe my cousin has caused quite enough disturbance for one afternoon, and I would feel better knowing you arrived safely. Catherine nodded mutely, her eyes wide with romantic speculation that made Lydia want to sink through the cobblestones in embarrassment. They rode back in charged silence, Lydia and Catherine in the carriage, the Duke following on horseback like a guardian or a threat, depending on one's perspective. And with every mile, Lydia felt the noose of impossibility tightening around her chest, making it hard to breathe. Because words written in shadow had found someone who understood them, who saw value in brutal honesty and unconventional thinking. But understanding and action were separated by an unbridgeable chasm of social expectation, family obligation, and consequences neither of them had the courage to face. Not yet, anyway. But perhaps, just perhaps, courage could be learned. Perhaps it could be built slowly, one impossible choice at a time. The repercussions arrived faster than Lydia expected, with the brutal efficiency of well-aimed gossip. By dinner that evening, everyone at Thornfield Manor knew that the Duke had publicly confronted Felix on Lydia's behalf. The whispers followed her into the dining room like a physical presence, curious, speculative, hungry for scandal and drama. Her mother's face was white with fury, carefully suppressed beneath social propriety. Felix himself was conspicuously absent from the meal, allegedly suffering from a headache, though everyone knew it was wounded pride keeping him away. Lady Constance, however, sat beside the Dowager Duchess with the serene confidence of a woman who had just been handed a devastating weapon and knew exactly how to wield it. Such excitement in the village this afternoon, she said brightly as the first course was served, her voice carrying through the room with calculated clarity. I hear there was quite a dramatic scene between His Grace and Lord Ashton, over Miss Carwell, of all people. The emphasis on "of all people" made clear exactly what she thought of Lydia's worth. Several guests turned to stare, and Lydia carefully kept her eyes on her plate, refusing to give them the satisfaction of visible reaction. Lord Ashton was behaving inappropriately, the Duke said from the head of the table, his tone brooking absolutely no argument. I merely reminded him of proper conduct toward ladies. Any gentleman would have done the same." "How chivalrous," Constance purred, and there was poison in her sweetness. "Though I do wonder if such dramatic intervention was entirely necessary, Your Grace. After all, Miss Carwell chose to venture into the village without proper male escort, conducting business like a merchant. Some might say she invited trouble through her unconventional behavior. Some would be demonstrably wrong. The Duke set down his wineglass with precise, controlled force. "Miss Carwell was conducting charitable business on behalf of our event, our jointly organized event that you have shown remarkably little interest in actually working on. That she requires protection from men who should know better reflects poorly on them, not on her initiative and competence." It should have ended there, but Constance was far from finished. She had been building to this moment, gathering ammunition, preparing her attack. "Of course, Your Grace, you are always so quick to defend Miss Carwell's choices." She paused delicately, letting tension build. "Though I confess I am troubled by certain rumors circulating among the household staff, disturbing rumors about missing diary pages, about private confessions that were perhaps not meant to remain private, about inappropriate feelings expressed in writing." She let the words sink in, watched Lydia's face for reaction. "I would hate for Miss Carwell's reputation to suffer due to indiscretion, due to inappropriate attachments formed toward those far above her station." The room went absolutely silent. Lydia's heart stopped beating entirely. This was the killing strike, the moment Constance revealed she possessed the stolen pages, that she knew every vulnerable, humiliating truth Lydia had written in desperate privacy. "What rumors?" the Duke asked quietly, and there was something deadly in his softness now. "Oh, merely that Miss Carwell keeps a diary filled with rather unkind observations about her betters, cruel assessments of people who have shown her nothing but hospitality, and that certain pages have gone mysteriously missing." Constance smiled with false sympathy. "One wonders what might be written on them. One wonders who might possess them now, and what use might be made of such revealing confessions." It was a threat delivered with surgical precision. "Submit to me, acknowledge my superiority, or I will destroy you publicly with your own words." Lydia's hands clenched white-knuckled in her lap, her mind racing through impossible options. "How fascinating that you know so much about Miss Carwell's private property, Lady Constance." The Duke's voice cut through her panic like a blade through silk. "Almost as if you had inappropriate access to it, which would of course constitute theft, a serious criminal matter regardless of social standing." Constance's smile faltered fractionally. "I know only what household servants gossip about, Your Grace. I cannot be held responsible for what they discuss among themselves." "Then you should inform your personal servants that spreading malicious gossip about a guest in this house is grounds for immediate dismissal without references." He turned his attention deliberately to the room at large, his authority settling over everyone like a physical weight. "Miss Carwell's private writings are her own business and her own property. Anyone found interfering with that property, stealing pages, or spreading malicious rumors based on stolen material will be removed from this house immediately and face potential legal consequences. Am I perfectly understood?" The weight of ducal authority, backed by real legal power and social consequences, settled over the table like heavy snow. People nodded quickly, murmured hasty agreement, suddenly fascinated by their food, and Constance's face flushed dark red beneath her powder, her carefully constructed attack turned back on her with humiliating public force. But Lydia knew with absolute certainty that this was not over. She had seen the calculating fury in Constance's eyes, the cold rage of someone who had been thwarted publicly. The other woman would not forgive this defeat. Next time, she would be more careful, more subtle. Next time, she would ensure there were no witnesses to her methods. After dinner, Lydia escaped to the terrace, desperate for air that did not taste of malice and social maneuvering. The night was cool, stars scattered across the deep sky like diamond chips, and she leaned against the cold stone balustrade, trying to remember how to breathe normally, how to calm her racing heart. "You should not be out here alone, Miss Carwell." She did not turn at the Duke's voice, could not bear to see whatever expression he wore, whether it was pity or concern or something more dangerous. "I seem to be causing you a remarkable amount of trouble, Your Grace." "You are causing Lady Constance trouble. There is a significant difference." He came to stand beside her, careful not to touch, but close enough that she felt the warmth of him in the cool night air. "She has your diary pages. You know that now, yes?" "I suspected before. Now I am certain." She kept her eyes fixed on the dark gardens, though I still do not understand why she would bother. What could she possibly gain from stealing the private thoughts of someone as insignificant as me? Leverage, control, the ability to destroy you if you become too much of a threat to her plans. He was quiet for a long moment, then added softly, "Are you? A threat to her carefully constructed future? I am no one, Your Grace. A girl with a modest inheritance, unmarketable interests, and a talent for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. How could I possibly threaten Lady Constance Marlowe and her inevitable triumph? You made me laugh." The confession was quiet, almost reluctant, as if extracted against his will. In 3 full seasons of courtship from dozens of accomplished, beautiful, well-connected women, not one of them has made me genuinely laugh, or made me think about anything beyond estate management and parliamentary votes, or made me question whether the life I had carefully planned was actually the one I wanted to live. You did all of that in less than a week, Miss Carwell, so yes, you are very much a threat to Constance's plans. Lydia's breath caught painfully in her chest. She turned to look at him finally, found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Longing and resignation mixed together in equal, devastating measure. "You cannot mean that, Your Grace." "I wish desperately that I did not. It would make everything so much simpler, so much cleaner." His hand moved toward hers, where it rested on the stone balustrade, stopped just short of actual contact. "But some truths, once recognized and acknowledged, cannot be unlearned or forgotten. I heard you read your diary that first night in the library. I heard you admit you feared never being chosen for who you truly are, only for what you could provide. And I realized with perfect uncomfortable clarity that I feared exactly the same thing, that I would spend my entire life performing an expected role and never know what it felt like to actually want something, to want someone real. And Lady Constance?" She had to ask, even though the answer might shatter her completely. "Sees the Duke of Ravensmere, sees a title, power, social position, access to the right circles. She wants what I represent, not who I am." He stopped, shook his head with something like frustration. "It does not matter what she wants or does not want. My mother expects an engagement announcement. The Dowager Duchess has made her preferences abundantly clear, and I have never, not once in my entire life, disappointed her expectations. Then why are you telling me any of this?" The question came out raw, almost angry. "Why make me hope for something that can never exist? Why not just leave me alone to marry Felix and live whatever miserable, appropriate life awaits me? Why torture us both with impossible confessions? Because you deserve better than Felix Ashton and his contempt. Because someone should tell you that you are remarkable exactly as you are, stubborn and clever and terrifyingly honest in a world that punishes honesty at every turn. Even if I am not brave enough to—" He did not finish. Could not finish, but his hand finally closed over hers on the cold stone balustrade, warm and solid and devastatingly real. And for a moment that stretched like eternity, they stood there in the darkness, holding on to something fragile and impossible that neither of them had the courage to fully claim. Then footsteps sounded from inside the house, approaching rapidly. They sprang apart like guilty children caught stealing sweets, putting proper distance between them just as a servant emerged onto the terrace. But the touch lingered on Lydia's skin long after, a ghost of warmth that promised nothing and everything, that whispered of possibilities she did not dare examine too closely. And somewhere in the house behind them, Lady Constance stood at a darkened window, watching them with cold calculation and growing fury, already planning her next, more devastating move. Because some truths whispered in darkness demanded to be dragged into light, and when they were, everyone nearby would burn. The next 3 days passed in a fever dream of proximity and dangerous pretense. The charitable planning consumed everyone's attention, giving Lydia legitimate, socially acceptable reasons to be in the Duke's presence without raising immediate suspicion, though whispers still followed them through every room, hungry and speculative. They met in drawing rooms to discuss decoration schemes, walked through the manor gardens, ostensibly reviewing placement for display tables, reviewed lists of potential wealthy donors, with Catherine serving as their ever-present but increasingly knowing chaperone. And beneath every professional conversation, under every discussion of floral arrangements and seating charts, ran an undercurrent of something neither dared name aloud. "What do you think of including the children from the parish school in the opening program?" Lydia asked during one afternoon planning session, acutely aware that Constance sat across the drawing room, pretending to read, but actually watching them with predatory, unwavering focus. "I think it would be genuinely memorable, rather than merely appropriate," the Duke replied, and his eyes held hers a moment too long, conveying something beyond his words. His children have an uncanny way of telling truth without artifice or calculation, rather like certain diary writers I have had the privilege of encountering. The reference to that first night in the library made heat flood Lydia's cheeks, but she managed to keep her voice steady and professional. "Then we should arrange it with the schoolmaster. Lady Constance, do you agree with this proposal?" Constance's smile could have cut glass and drawn blood. "If you believe parading poor children with their rough manners before the ton is appropriate entertainment, who am I to argue with your unique vision? Though I do question whether our distinguished guests will find such common displays tasteful, or whether it might reflect poorly on the entire event. Our guests will find it human and authentic," the Duke said flatly, his tone brooking no argument. "Which is rather the entire point of charitable work, actual connection with those we claim to serve. Or did you think we were gathering 200 people simply to admire your flower arrangements and congratulate ourselves on our own generosity?" The cut was surgical, delivered without raising his voice, but its impact was devastating. Constance's two ever-present friends exchanged nervous, uncomfortable glances. Even her closest ally seemed to sense the fundamental shift in dynamics occurring in the room. The Duke was no longer merely tolerating Lydia's presence or indulging her unconventional suggestions. He was actively, repeatedly, publicly choosing her ideas over Constance's objections. And Constance was not a woman who accepted defeat or diminishment gracefully. That evening, Lydia returned to her room after dinner to find her diary sitting openly on her bed, not hidden in the trunk where she had carefully concealed it that morning, but displayed prominently on the coverlet, pages spread wide as if someone had been reading leisurely through her most private thoughts. Her heart hammering painfully, she rushed forward and checked the binding with shaking hands. 3 more pages missing. Torn carefully, methodically from the center of the book, where she kept her most recent, most vulnerable entries. This was not theft born of curiosity. This was a calculated message, a deliberate threat. Constance wanted her to know that she could access Lydia's most private thoughts whenever she wished, that nowhere was truly safe, that privacy was an illusion easily shattered. that resistance would only make the eventual, inevitable humiliation infinitely worse. Lydia sank onto the bed, clutching the violated diary to her chest, and permitted herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the crushing weight of helplessness, to let tears of frustration and fear fall unchecked. Then she stood, splashed cold water on her burning face from the wash basin, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. She would not cower or beg. She would not apologize for existing or for having thoughts of her own. And she would absolutely not give Constance the satisfaction of seeing her break publicly. If fighting back meant risking everything, her reputation, her family's precarious financial security, her own foolish and impossible feelings for a duke who could never truly be hers, then so be it. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the battle seemed already lost, even when victory was impossible. She found Catherine in their favorite corner of the library, curled in an oversized chair with a novel and a plate of biscuits stolen from the kitchen. "I need your help," Lydia said without preamble, closing the door behind her. "And what I am about to ask may put you in an uncomfortable position." Her sister looked up immediately, setting aside her book with complete focus. "What has happened now?" "Lady Constance has been systematically stealing pages from my diary over the past week. 3 more went missing today." Lydia moved closer, keeping her voice low. "I need to know exactly what she plans to do with them, when she intends to strike. And I need to know if there is any possible way to retrieve them before she uses my own words to destroy me publicly." Catherine's expression transformed from concern to fierce determination. At 19, she still possessed the fearlessness and moral clarity of someone who had not yet learned how thoroughly cruel the world could be to women who stepped out of line. "Tell me exactly what you need me to do." They spent the next hour hatching a plan that was either brilliantly strategic or catastrophically stupid. Lydia genuinely could not decide which. Catherine would deliberately befriend one of Constance's constant companions, Miss Hartwell, who seemed less enthusiastically committed to cruelty than her mistress. She would subtly plant seeds of doubt about Constance's behavior, suggest that such treatment of another guest was unbecoming of true nobility, and hopefully extract crucial information about where the diary pages were hidden and what Constance planned to do with them. It was admittedly a long shot, dependent on Miss Hartwell's conscience and discretion, but it was infinitely better than waiting passively for destruction to arrive. Over the next 2 days, Catherine worked her particular magic with impressive skill. She was genuinely talented at making people feel valued and seen, at drawing out confidences, at creating the comfortable illusion of friendship where strategic alliance actually existed. And Miss Hartwell, perpetually lonely and overlooked in Constance's glittering shadow, proved surprisingly willing to talk, once she felt safe. "Lady Constance keeps the stolen pages in her jewelry box," Catherine reported breathlessly late on the second day, finding Lydia in the conservatory, where she had been attempting to sketch botanical samples and failing utterly due to distraction. "Miss Hartwell has seen them with her own eyes. She says Constance reads them aloud to her inner circle, Lady Margaret and 2 others, and they laugh about your—" She stopped, her expression pained and sympathetic. "About my what, Catherine?" Lydia asked, though dread already told her the answer. "About your feelings for the Duke, about how you write about his hands and his voice, and the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. About your hope that maybe, possibly, he might—" Catherine's cheeks flushed deep pink with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Lydia. I did not know you had written such vulnerable things, such private feelings." Lydia closed her eyes against a wave of humiliation so intense it felt physical. Those entries were from after the terrace encounter, after he had touched her hand and called her remarkable. She had poured her confused, desperate, impossible feelings onto paper because she had absolutely nowhere else to put them, no one to confide in about the strange, terrifying hope growing in her chest. And now Constance possessed them, Irrefutable evidence of impropriety, of inappropriate attachment, of feelings that could destroy any remaining shred of reputation Lydia still possessed. When is she planning to use them publicly? Her voice sounded remarkably calm, despite the panic screaming through her mind. At the benefit ball, during the charitable presentation when everyone is gathered. Catherine gripped both her hands tightly. She plans to read them aloud, to frame it as evidence that you have been deliberately pursuing the Duke inappropriately, using charitable work as an excuse to force proximity. Lydia, we have to get those pages back somehow. How? Break into her room and steal them back? That would only make everything infinitely worse and give her additional ammunition. Then we tell the Duke. He has defended you before. He clearly cares what happens to you. No. The word came out sharp, absolute, non-negotiable. I will not run to him for rescue like some helpless damsel in a melodramatic novel. This is my mistake, my private stupidity committed to paper. I will handle the consequences myself, on my own terms. How? Catherine's question hung in the air, unanswered and seemingly unanswerable. That was indeed the question, was it not? How did one fight an enemy who possessed devastating ammunition and the unquestioned social standing to wield it without consequence? How did one win a battle that had been strategically lost before it even began? Lydia did not know the answer yet. But she would find a way forward, or she would go down fighting on her own terms rather than cowering. That night, unable to sleep, Lydia returned to the library where everything had begun, where her carefully constructed life had first started unraveling. She sat in the same window seat, holding her violated diary, wondering if the Duke ever thought about that first meeting, if he remembered the exact words she had read aloud, the vulnerable confession about feeling unsellable, unmarketable, invisible. You should not be here alone at this hour, Miss Carwell. She jumped, but did not drop the diary this time. Some instinct had been half expecting him, half hoping he would appear as if summoned by the sheer weight of her longing. I needed somewhere quiet to think without interruption, she said softly, to plan. You are plotting something strategic. He emerged fully from the shadows, and she saw genuine concern on his face. I have learned to recognize that particular expression. You look exactly the way you did before you told Lady Constance she was decidedly common, determined and slightly reckless. Despite everything, Lydia almost smiled at the memory. That was perhaps tactically unwise. That was absolutely magnificent. He came closer, then seemed to think better of it, and stopped a careful distance away. Tell me what Constance has done now. What new cruelty has she devised? Nothing I cannot handle on my own. Lydia. Her name in his voice, without the formal address, nearly shattered her carefully maintained composure entirely. You do not have to carry this burden alone. Let me help you. Yes, I absolutely do carry this alone, because if I let you help me again, if I let you defend me publicly one more time, it will only make the inevitable outcome infinitely worse for both of us. She turned to face him fully, forcing herself to meet his eyes despite the pain it caused. You are going to propose to Lady Constance. Everyone knows it, expects it, plans around it. Your mother has made her wishes abundantly clear. Society anticipates the announcement. And I... Her voice cracked despite her best efforts. I need to stop hoping for anything different. I need to accept reality. What if I do not propose to her? The question hung in the air like a physical presence, dangerous and intoxicating. Lydia stared at him, afraid to breathe, afraid to hope. Your Grace, you cannot possibly... Nathaniel! His voice was rough, urgent. My name is Nathaniel, and I want to hear you say it at least once before I make what might be either the worst mistake or the bravest decision of my entire life. What decision? But she knew. Could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the desperate determination in his eyes. Choosing what I actually want over what is expected and appropriate. His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers threading through hers with devastating certainty, with absolute rightness. I have spent my entire adult life doing exactly what was expected. I became Duke at 23 when my father died suddenly. I managed estates and tenants and parliamentary votes and family expectations. I courted appropriate women who saw me as a title to acquire, a position to claim. And I have been— He stopped, searching for honest words. Content. Not happy, never happy, but content with my duty, until I heard you read your diary aloud in this very room and realized with perfect, uncomfortable clarity that I had been slowly starving my entire life without even knowing it. Tears burned behind Lydia's eyes, hot and insistent. You cannot mean this, you cannot. I have never meant anything more in my life. But I am also a coward who does not know how to want something without permission, without approval. His thumb traced slow circles on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. Tell me what to do, Lydia. Tell me how to be brave enough to choose you when everything I was raised to believe says I should not. She should have told him to leave, to forget this conversation, to protect them both from inevitable disaster. Instead, she heard herself whisper words that felt like jumping off a cliff into darkness. Kiss me. Just once. So I know this is real and not something I imagined in desperate, lonely solitude. He moved slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but she did not move, could not move. His hand cupped her cheek with devastating gentleness, and when his lips touched hers, the entire world condensed to this single point of contact, soft and questioning and heartbreakingly tender and absolutely perfect. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Less than that. A brief breath of possibility that ended far too soon when footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark, with want and anguish mixed together. I am going to find a way to make this possible. I do not know how yet, but I will find a way to— Your Grace? A servant's hesitant voice from the doorway made them spring apart with guilty speed. The Dowager Duchess requests your immediate presence in her sitting room. She says it is urgent. The Duke's expression shifted back to ducal composure so quickly, Lydia wondered if she had imagined everything that came before. Professional mask firmly in place, authority settling over him like a familiar cloak. Tell her I will be there momentarily. The servant departed, and they were left in charged, painful silence. Nathaniel, because she could think of him as Nathaniel now, even if she could never say it aloud in public, looked at her with something like desperation mixed with determination. This is not finished between us? It has to be, she said softly, trying to protect them both. You know it has to be. No, I refuse to accept that as inevitable. His voice was fierce now. You deserve to be chosen, Lydia. You deserve everything. And I have been a coward long enough. He left then, though she saw him hesitate in the doorway, as if waiting for her to call him back. She did not, could not. Some cruelties were necessary for survival. Some truths spoken in shadow needed to stay there, safe from the harsh, unforgiving light of social reality. But her lips still burned from his kiss, and her hand still felt the ghost of his touch. And somewhere in the house, Lady Constance plotted with stolen diary pages that would ensure Lydia's complete and public humiliation. Words written in shadow had found their intended mark. Now they would become weapons designed to destroy. The ball was 3 days away when everything accelerated toward inevitable catastrophe with frightening speed. The Dowager Duchess announced at breakfast, her voice ringing with authority and finality, that she expected an official engagement between her son and Lady Constance to be announced at the charitable event as a fitting reward for their successful collaboration. Lydia's mother nearly wept with relief when Felix cornered Lydia after breakfast and formally proposed with mumbled, graceless words about duty and financial suitability, presenting his grandmother's ring, a heavy, ugly thing that felt like a shackle. Lydia accepted because refusing meant Catherine's limited prospects died with her own, and she could not be selfish enough to destroy her sister's future out of pride or impossible hope. But wearing Felix's ring felt like imprisonment, cold and unforgiving against her skin. Across the breakfast table, she had watched Nathaniel's face go carefully, painfully blank, as his mother detailed the elaborate engagement announcement she had planned. Lady Constance positively glowed with triumph, already imagining herself as Duchess, already mentally redecorating. And Lydia felt something inside her crack completely and go cold. This was reality. What had happened in the library was a beautiful, painful lie, a moment of weakness they would both regret. She needed to accept the truth, smile through it, and prepare for a life of hollow performance beside a man who saw her as a solution to financial problems rather than a person worthy of genuine affection. That afternoon, she threw herself into final preparations for the ball with manic, desperate energy. The local tradespeople had created stunning displays that exceeded all expectations. The children from the parish school practiced their opening song with earnest concentration. Everything was coming together beautifully, professionally, successfully, which only made the impending personal disaster more bitter and ironic. Catherine found her in the ballroom late that afternoon, arranging flowers with such focused intensity she did not hear her sister approach until a gentle hand touched her shoulder. "Lydia, you need to rest. You have been working for 6 straight hours without stopping. I need to be useful. It is the only thing I have left to offer." "That is absolutely not true, and you know it." Catherine glanced around to ensure they were alone, then lowered her voice urgently. "Miss Hartwell came to me again this morning. She is genuinely frightened of what Lady Constance is planning. She said—" Catherine stopped, as if unsure whether to continue. "Just tell me everything." "Constance is not merely going to read your diary pages publicly. She has constructed an entire false narrative." Catherine's voice was tight with anger. "She plans to claim you deliberately seduced the Duke to escape Felix's courtship, that you threw yourself at him shamelessly. She has bribed witnesses, servants who will swear they saw you entering his private study alone at inappropriate hours. She has forged letters supposedly from you to him, expressing inappropriate feelings. It is all fabricated lies, but who will believe me over her?" Lydia finished, numb with the certainty of it. The flowers in her hands suddenly seemed absurd, frivolous things, while her entire existence burned down around her. "When does she plan this public execution?" "During the charity presentation, when all 200 guests are assembled, in front of everyone who matters socially. She wants maximum humiliation, wants to make an example that will warn off any other woman who might dare threaten her position." Of course she did. This was no longer about winning Nathaniel or securing the duchy. This was about destroying any woman audacious enough to challenge Constance's carefully constructed superiority. About proving that women like Lydia, poor, plain, peculiar, would always lose to women like her. "Then I will not give her the satisfaction of destroying me." Lydia set down the flowers with deliberate, final care. "I will leave before the ball. Take Catherine and return home immediately. Let Constance have her empty victory over an absent opponent. You absolutely cannot run. That proves her right in everyone's eyes, that you are guilty and ashamed and defeated. What realistic choice do I have, Catherine? Stay and let her destroy me publicly with fabricated evidence I cannot disprove. Drag Nathaniel, the Duke, into scandal that could damage him? Watch our family's remaining reputation shatter completely?" She pressed her hands to her face, exhausted beyond anything she had ever felt. "I'm so tired. Tired of fighting battles I cannot win. Tired of hoping for impossible things. Maybe it is finally time to accept defeat gracefully. That does not sound remotely like my sister speaking." Catherine gripped her shoulders hard. "The Lydia I know and admire would face this head-on, would find a way to turn Constance's weapon back against her, would fight. That Lydia is a naive fool who writes romantic nonsense in diaries and believes truth matters more than power and connections. But even as she said it, something stirred in her chest, a flicker of the stubborn pride that had gotten her into this entire mess. "What would you possibly have me do? I cannot prove the letters are forged. I cannot disprove witnesses who will swear to lies for money." "No, but you can tell your own truth first, publicly, in your own voice, before she has any chance to twist it into something shameful." Lydia stared at her sister as the idea took shape, crystallized into something concrete and terrifying. It was risky, potentially catastrophic, would likely fail. But if she was going to burn regardless, perhaps she could choose her own fire, speak her own truth, rather than letting Constance define her narrative. "The presentation," she said slowly, testing the words. "I am supposed to speak about the charitable work accomplished. What if I speak about truth instead? About the cost of honesty in a world that values performance over authenticity? About women forced to hide their real selves to be deemed acceptable?" Constance will interrupt immediately. "Will produce your diary pages as supposed proof of hypocrisy. Let her. If I acknowledge them first, if I own my words instead of being shamed by them, she loses her primary weapon." Lydia's mind raced, already composing the speech, finding the exact words. "I will not apologize for writing honestly about my feelings. I will not pretend I am some empty vessel waiting to be filled with appropriate thoughts. And if society condemns me for that basic honesty, then perhaps I was never meant to fit into this society at all." Catherine's eyes shone with fierce pride and love. "That is my sister. That is exactly who you are." They spent hours crafting Lydia's speech, refining every word until it balanced vulnerability with strength, confession with defiance, personal truth with broader meaning. It would not save her reputation. Nothing could do that once Constance played her carefully prepared hand. But it would be Lydia's truth, spoken in her own voice and her own words, before anyone could twist it into something shameful or pathetic. She did not tell Nathaniel her plan, could not bear to see the expression on his face when he realized she was about to sacrifice herself publicly, spectacularly, in front of everyone who mattered. Some acts of courage required absolute solitude to accomplish. The night before the ball, she sat at her writing desk and added one final entry to her diary, words she hoped someone might read someday and understand. "Tomorrow I speak truths that society desperately wants to remain hidden. I will admit to feelings considered inappropriate, to thoughts deemed unwomanly, to desires that do not fit into acceptable categories. And I will do so knowing it will cost me absolutely everything: reputation, security, family standing, perhaps even my sister's future prospects. But some cages, no matter how gilded or socially appropriate, are not worth inhabiting. If I must burn, I will burn brightly and honestly. If I must fall, I will fall on my own chosen terms. And perhaps somewhere, someone else trapped in shadow will read these words and find courage to speak their own truth. That would be legacy enough for any life." She closed the diary, placed it carefully in her trunk, and prepared for battle. The ballroom at Thornfield Manor glittered with hundreds of candles, transforming the space into something magical and slightly unreal. Guests arrived in glittering waves, lords and ladies dressed in their finest, jewels catching candlelight, all pretending charitable work was their true passion while secretly hoping for scandal to enliven an otherwise predictable evening. They would definitely not be disappointed tonight. Lydia wore a simple gown of deep blue silk that Catherine had helped her choose, refusing her mother's frantic attempts to dress her in something more elaborate and fashionable. If she was going to speak painful truth, she would do so as herself, unadorned, unashamed, authentic to her core. Felix kept trying to position himself at her elbow, playing the devoted fiancé, but she evaded him with practiced efficiency honed over weeks. Across the ballroom, Nathaniel stood beside his mother and Lady Constance, the absolute picture of ducal perfection in evening dress. Their eyes met once across the crowded room, and she saw confusion there, hurt perhaps that she had been avoiding him for 2 days. But she could not weaken now, could not let him try to protect her from consequences she had deliberately chosen. The evening progressed according to careful plan. The craft displays were admired extensively, substantial donations were pledged with competitive enthusiasm, and the parish children performed their song with earnest sweetness that brought genuine smiles to even the most jaded aristocratic faces. Then came the moment everyone had been anticipating, the presentations from Lady Constance and Miss Carwell about the charitable work accomplished. Constance spoke first, delivering a polished, perfectly appropriate speech about the duty of the privileged to care for the less fortunate. It was flawlessly executed, utterly forgettable, and received enthusiastic applause. Then she smiled with poisonous, triumphant sweetness and turned to introduce Lydia. And now Miss Carwell will share her unique perspective on charity and truth. I am absolutely certain we will all find her remarks most illuminating and memorable. Takudays, the threat was crystal clear to anyone paying attention. This was Constance's moment to strike decisively. But Lydia walked to the front of the assembled crowd with steady steps, carrying not prepared notes for a speech, but her diary, held openly, defiantly. She opened it to a marked page and began to read aloud in a clear, unwavering voice. I write these words, knowing they make me unmarketable in polite society. Too honest, too peculiar, too fond of books and truth over charm and strategic performance. But this diary represents the only place I could be entirely myself, without apology or pretense or fear of judgment. Tonight, I am bringing that dangerous honesty into the light, before anyone else can weaponize it against me. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. Nathaniel straightened visibly, alarm crossing his aristocratic features. Constance's smile grew sharper, anticipating total victory, and Lydia kept reading, kept speaking her truth. I have written about feeling invisible, about being treated as merchandise rather than a person with thoughts and value. I have written about men who court bank accounts rather than women. About mothers who see daughters as investments in social positioning, about a society that values performance over authenticity at every turn. And yes, she met Constance's gaze directly, unflinching. I have written about developing genuine feelings for someone I absolutely should not want, someone whose world and mine can never intersect without disaster and scandal. She closed the diary carefully, holding it against her chest like armor or a shield. Lady Constance has stolen multiple pages from this diary over the past weeks. She plans to read them here tonight, to shame me publicly for daring to have inappropriate thoughts and unacceptable desires, for reaching above my designated station. So I am reading them first. I am owning my own words, and I am saying clearly, without apology, I am not ashamed of honesty. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Her mother gasped audibly, half rising from her seat with horror plain on her face. Felix's face went purple with outrage and humiliation. The Dowager Duchess looked like she might faint, and Nathaniel stared at her with an expression she could not decipher, something between devastation and awe. Miss Carwell. Constance's voice cut through the noise, triumphant and viciously cruel. How remarkably noble of you to confess your obsession with his grace, though you have conveniently left out certain crucial details. Perhaps you would like to explain to everyone the letters you sent to him, the times you deliberately arranged to be alone with him, the way you systematically pursued him while engaged to another man. That is enough. Nathaniel's voice cracked like thunder, silencing everyone instantly and completely. He strode forward with barely controlled fury, positioning himself deliberately beside Lydia, his presence both shelter and public statement. Miss Carwell sent me no letters. She arranged absolutely nothing. Every single conversation we have had occurred because I sought her out, because I valued her honesty and intelligence above the calculated performance everyone else constantly offers. The Dowager Duchess stood, fury radiating from her like heat. "Nathaniel, you cannot possibly—" "I can, Mother, and I absolutely will." He turned to face the assembled crowd, and Lydia watched him transform from dutiful son into something harder, more certain, more himself than she had ever seen. Lady Constance has spent weeks attempting to manipulate and control both Miss Carwell and myself. She has stolen private property repeatedly. She has forged evidence. She has attempted to manufacture scandal to eliminate a woman she perceived as competition. And I am completely finished pretending I do not see it clearly. Constance's face went white, then red. "Your Grace, I have no idea what lies—" "Show them!" His voice was cold, implacable, absolutely authoritative. "Show everyone the diary pages you stole, the ones you have been using to threaten Miss Carwell for weeks. Produce them right now." "I have no such—" "Your companion, Miss Hartwell, has already provided written testimony about witnessing your theft and your plans." He gestured to where Miss Hartwell stood trembling near the doorway, clearly having been convinced or coerced to turn against her former mistress. "She has confessed everything, where you keep the stolen pages, how you plan to use them, the servants you bribed to provide false testimony. So I will ask you one final time, produce the stolen pages immediately." The silence stretched unbearably. Then Felix, of all people, stepped forward with an expression of pure, calculating self-preservation, throwing Constance to the wolves to save himself. "I saw Lady Constance reading pages that clearly did not belong to her," he announced to the room at large. "She showed them to me, claimed she planned to use them tonight. I told her it was fundamentally dishonorable, but she—" He shrugged with cowardly deflection. Constance's carefully constructed composure shattered completely. She fumbled in her reticule with shaking hands and threw several folded pages at Lydia's feet with violent fury. "Fine, yes, I took them, but only because this nobody was trying to steal a duke. She does not deserve—" "Deserve?" Nathaniel's voice was soft, deadly, more frightening than shouting. "You speak of deserve while admitting to theft, conspiracy, and attempted character assassination. You fabricate evidence, manipulate witnesses, and you dare judge anyone's worthiness?" He turned deliberately to his mother, ignoring Constance completely now. "The engagement you planned will not occur. Not with Lady Constance, not tonight, not ever. I am finished with appropriate matches and strategic alliances." The Dowager Duchess swayed, gripping her chair. "You are throwing away your entire future for a girl with no connections, no significant fortune, no—" "She has integrity, Mother. She has genuine courage. She has honesty so rare I barely recognized it when I first encountered it." He turned to Lydia, and his eyes held everything they had never said aloud. "She has everything that actually matters in a partner and companion, and I have been too much of a coward to say so publicly until now." Lydia's breath caught painfully. "Your Grace, you do not have to sacrifice—" "Nathaniel," he corrected gently but firmly. "My name is Nathaniel, and I am not sacrificing anything. I am choosing something real for perhaps the first time in my entire life. I am choosing what I genuinely want, rather than what is merely expected and appropriate." He took her hand in full view of 200 witnesses. "Scandal be damned. If you will have me, Miss Carwell, though I would completely understand if you refused after I made you fight this entire battle alone for so long. You gave me space to fight it myself," she said, tears streaming down her face without shame or attempt to hide them. "You did not try to rescue me as if I were helpless. You let me be strong, let me speak my own truth. That is—" Her voice broke completely. "That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. Then say yes, marry me. Not because you need security or because society demands it or because it solves practical problems, but because you want to. Because we would both rather face scandal and disapproval together than live appropriate lives and die slowly apart. She should have been practical, should have considered her family's financial situation, Catherine's marriage prospects, all the rational reasons why refusing a duke's heartfelt proposal would be absolute madness. Instead, she said the only truth that genuinely mattered. Yes. The room exploded into chaos again, gasps and shocked whispers, and several ladies fanning themselves dramatically. Her mother burst into tears, though whether from joy or horror remained unclear. Felix retreated rapidly, already calculating how to minimize his association with this spectacular scandal. And Constance stood frozen, watching her carefully constructed world collapse entirely around her. The Dowager Duchess drew herself up with icy, wounded dignity. "If you do this, Nathaniel, you will do so without my blessing, without my presence or support. I will not witness my only son throw away everything our family has built for—" "Then leave, mother." His voice was not cruel, but it was absolutely final, unbending. "I love you, but I will not spend my entire life imprisoned in a cage of your expectations and outdated social requirements. If you cannot accept my choice, if you cannot accept Lydia, then perhaps you should return to the Dower House until you reconsider." She left without another word, her skirts rustling with outrage and wounded pride. Half the assembled guests followed her, scandalized and titillated in equal measure, already composing the letters they would write describing this unprecedented drama. But half remained, and on many faces was something like respect, admiration even, for a man who had chosen authentic feeling over convenient duty. Felix attempted one last pathetic effort to salvage something, stepping forward with false bravado. "Carwell, your daughter is engaged to me. This is breach of... This is your opportunity to withdraw gracefully and preserve what remains of your dignity," Nathaniel said coldly, dangerously. "Unless you would prefer me to inquire more deeply into your substantial debts and the rather creative accounting you have employed to hide them from creditors. I have considerable resources for investigation. The only question is whether you wish me to use them." Felix paled dramatically and retreated without another word, his courtship abandoned as quickly as it had begun, his pride in ruins. Lydia watched it all, feeling oddly disconnected, as if this were happening to someone else entirely. Then Nathaniel's hand tightened around hers, warm and solid and impossibly real, and she understood this was actually happening. Impossibly, miraculously, devastatingly real. "We should probably finish the charitable presentations properly," she said, because she did not know what else to say when your entire world had just been upended completely. He laughed, actually laughed, the sound raw and free, and more beautiful than anything she had ever heard from him. "Only you would worry about protocol and propriety, after bringing down a would-be duchess and half the peerage simultaneously. Someone has to care about the children's song. They worked so very hard practicing. Then let us finish properly and appropriately." He raised his voice to address the remaining guests with ducal authority. "The evening will continue exactly as planned. Donations will still be gratefully accepted. And I expect everyone to behave with appropriate decorum, regardless of personal feelings about recent revelations and decisions. It was a command backed by power and consequence, and people obeyed." The ball resumed, awkwardly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm as guests realized they were witnessing legendary scandal firsthand. Donations actually increased substantially, perhaps because everyone wanted to claim they had been present at the Duke of Ravensmere's most dramatic and romantic evening. Lydia found herself surrounded by well-wishers and the boldly curious, all wanting to touch the woman who had spoken forbidden truths, and somehow not just survived, but triumphed. Catherine hugged her so tightly she could barely breathe, whispering fierce pride and love. Even her mother eventually approached, tear-stained and trembling. "You foolish, impossibly brave girl," she said, touching Lydia's cheek with tentative gentleness. "I spent so long trying to make you into something acceptable and appropriate that I never truly saw you were already extraordinary, exactly as you were." "Mama, no, let me finish. I was wrong. About you, about Felix, about what actually matters in this life. Your father would have been so immensely proud of the woman you have become." She glanced at Nathaniel, who had been pulled aside by several lords apparently eager to congratulate him privately. "That man looks at you the way your father used to look at me before the world taught us both to be grimly practical. Do not let anyone steal that from you, Lydia, not even me." The reconciliation was far from complete. Could not be after years of disappointment and misunderstanding. But it was a genuine beginning, and tonight Lydia would accept beginnings as enough. As the evening finally wound down, she found herself alone with Nathaniel in the conservatory, stealing a moment of quiet away from prying eyes and endless questions. "Your mother will never forgive me," she said softly, reality crashing back. "My mother will adjust to reality eventually, and if she does not, I will survive her disapproval." He pulled her close, his arms careful and sure around her. "I meant every word I said tonight, Lydia, every single one. I know you did. That is what terrifies me." She pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of him. "I am genuinely frightened." "Of what, specifically?" "That I will wake tomorrow and discover this was an elaborate dream born of desperation. That you will realize you made a catastrophic mistake in the clear light of day. That I am not—" She stopped, old fears surfacing despite everything. "That I am fundamentally not enough." He tilted her face up gently but firmly, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me carefully, Lydia Carwell. You are brilliant and brave and brutally honest in a world drowning in beautiful, calculated lies. You read botanical illustrations for genuine pleasure. You write truths in darkness that most people never dare acknowledge even to themselves. You faced public humiliation with your head high and your voice steady and unwavering. You are so much more than enough that I genuinely fear being inadequate for you. You are a duke with immense power and resources. I am a man who has spent his entire adult life performing an expected role, meeting obligations. You made me want to be real instead of merely appropriate." His thumb traced her cheekbone with devastating tenderness. "Marry me quickly, before scandal grows worse. Let me show you what it means to be chosen deliberately every single day, not just in a moment of public drama." "Yes," she said again, because it remained the only word that truly mattered. "Yes, absolutely yes." They kissed there in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic flowers and the lingering ghost of impossible expectations they had both finally shed. And somewhere in the ruins of the evening, truth had found its way to light. Messy and costly and absolutely worth every sacrifice. 3 months later, Lydia Graydon, Duchess of Ravensmere, sat in her private library, writing the final entry in a diary she had nearly destroyed multiple times. The wedding had been deliberately small and surprisingly joyful, attended by those brave or genuine enough to defy convention and celebrate love over cold propriety. The Dowager Duchess had not attended, though she had sent a curt note grudgingly acknowledging the marriage after 2 months of pointed silence. Felix had fled to the continent to escape creditors and gossip, and Constance had retreated to her family's remote country estate in Scotland, her social prospects permanently devastated by her own manipulations. Catherine had become a permanent, delighted resident at Ravensmere, ostensibly as Lydia's companion, but actually because she loved the extensive library even more than Lydia did. They spent mornings reading companionably together, afternoons working with expanding local charities, and evenings hosting intimate dinners for an eclectic mix of scholars, artists, and people society generally found too peculiar or unconventional to fully embrace. Nathaniel had gifted her this library on their wedding night, a room designed specifically for her unique needs and interests, with floor-to-ceiling shelves for her growing botanical collection, a massive desk positioned to catch ideal morning light, and a deep window seat exactly like the one where they had first collided so dramatically. "So you always have a safe place to write truth," he had said softly, vulnerability clear in his voice. "Even truths you cannot speak aloud to me directly. I will never ask to read your diary again, Lydia. Your private thoughts belong to you alone. But I hope—" He had paused, suddenly uncertain. "I hope that someday you will not need to hide quite so much in shadow, that you can speak your deepest truth directly to me." They were learning that delicate balance together, slowly and imperfectly, learning how to be genuine partners instead of performers playing expected roles. It was messy and occasionally difficult and sometimes frustrating, but it was real and authentic. And real, Lydia had discovered with profound relief, was infinitely better than any comfortable alternative. She closed her diary now and looked at the final words she had just written. "I was wrong about so much, wrong to believe I was unmarketable and unworthy, wrong to think honest women could never be chosen deliberately, wrong to assume love was a fairy tale that only happened to other, more appropriate people. But I was right about one crucial thing. Some truths, once written in shadow, will always find their way to the person who desperately needs to hear them. Mine found a duke who was as lonely and trapped as I was, and together we learned that being truly seen, completely, entirely, honestly seen, is worth every risk, every scandal, every sacrifice demanded. This particular diary ends here, but my actual story continues, fuller and richer than I ever imagined possible. Are you writing manifestos and revolutionary tracts again?" Nathaniel's voice came from the doorway, warm with genuine affection and humor. "Just finishing a chapter of my life." She set down her pen and went to him, fitting against him with the easy, comfortable intimacy of 3 months' constant practice. "What brings you to my sanctuary, Your Grace?" "I wanted to see my remarkable wife." "Is that permitted, or are you too busy documenting my failures?" "Always permitted, and I document your successes far more than failures." She kissed him softly, then pulled back to study his face with concern. "You look pleased with yourself in a suspicious way. What have you done? I may have anonymously donated a very significant sum to establish a girls' school in Thornbrook Village. One that will teach botanical illustration, scientific observation, mathematics, and rigorous critical thinking alongside more traditional subjects." He smiled at her expression of shock and joy. "Someone I deeply respect recently convinced me that education represents charity's most powerful and lasting tool." Nathaniel, his name in her mouth, still felt like a precious gift, intimate and treasured. "I thought we could visit tomorrow. Help them select books for the library collection. Perhaps you could teach a class or two each week if you wished." He paused, vulnerability crossing his features. "I want our daughters, if we are blessed with them, to grow up in a world where being clever and honest is valued over being merely decorative and compliant, where speaking truth does not require quite so much courage. You made me believe that world is genuinely possible." She could not speak past the sudden overwhelming tightness in her throat, past the love flooding through her chest. So she simply held him instead, this man who had heard her truth spoken in darkness and chosen to bring it fully into light. Who loved her not despite her honesty, but precisely because of it. Who proved every single day that some fairy tales were real if you were brave enough to fight for them. They stood there in her library as afternoon faded gradually to evening, two people who had found each other in shadow and built something authentic in light. And if the world still whispered occasionally about the scandalous Duke of Ravensmere and his inappropriate wife, they no longer cared even slightly. Some stories began with secrets read aloud in silent libraries. Some began with humiliation and despair and impossible longing. But the best stories, the ones genuinely worth telling and remembering, began with truth spoken despite the cost, and ended with choosing love over every other reasonable, appropriate thing. Words written in shadow had finally found their proper light. And in that hard-won light, two people who had been slowly starving for authenticity finally learned what it meant to be genuinely, completely fed. The truth she had written alone in darkness now lived openly in daylight, and it was more beautiful than any secret could ever be. The end. Thank you so much for staying with Lydia and Nathaniel's journey all the way to the end. I hope their story resonated with you. The ache of feeling unseen, the terrifying risk of speaking truth,